And it's funny because for me, like, I never realized how horrible my boundaries were until I became a mom. And it kind of goes back to that. Like, once you have children, your priorities just shift so much. And they're like a little flashlight or mirror that like hones in on all these areas that you probably just buried right in the back of your mind. And now they're all coming out. And then that's when you start to realize, wow, I really need to set some boundaries here so that I can be in a good, healthy mental state with everyone around me. And so I really like to think of boundaries as a necessary act to maintain relationships, whether it's, work related, family related, with your partner, even with your children. And so the things that I like to do now is I really like to practice saying no
Mm.
to anything that just doesn't serve you, or even if you just don't want to do it, like really be mindful and get in that habit of practicing to say no. Because I think a lot of us don't really realize how much of a yes person we really are
Mhm.
until you have kids and you're like, oh, I can't say yes anymore. Like I have to
Mhm.
care for my baby. Something else that I really like to do is journal. So, when I was going through postpartum depression and anxiety, one of the tactics that we did was just journaling what feelings came up when certain areas were triggering. And these were all around like boundary work. And it really helped me kind of hone in on where I was struggling to set boundaries, but why I was struggling as well, like what my past was carrying that I just didn't necessarily realize.
Mhm.
And that's really great work to do if you are in therapy or if you're thinking about going to therapy. I always encourage people to look into that and just start practicing that acknowledgement piece, because that's kind of always where you start, is acknowledging and then working towards formulating a plan to reshift that thought process. But yeah, I would say if you also realize that you're burning out often, if you feel like you are always being taken advantage of, if you feel like you have no time for yourself and you can't fit anything in, like literally nothing into your day, those are pretty clear signs that you probably have some poor boundaries going on that really should be addressed for your mental health, and so you can show up for your family as well.
Yeah, those are great tips. I think definitely looking inward and being like, okay, what kind of makes me unhappy right now, or where do I feel taken advantage of? Because like you
Yeah.
said, I think a lot of times we don't even realize that our boundaries are being crossed because maybe we haven't fully addressed our boundaries or like laid them out. Like, okay, I don't like when this happens, or I don't want to say yes to that anymore because I think we're just used to being yes people. Like, oh, I don't
Yes.
need boundaries. I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that happens a lot. But like, so what are your recommendations for, okay, so like someone disrespecting a boundary? So like, have you personally had someone disrespect a boundary, and how did you then recognize that, and how did you go to the next step of being like, okay, this person disrespected my boundary, now this is what's going to happen?
Sure. And that's a good question because I think that comes up for so many of us. But when I first started learning how to set boundaries, like my boundaries were not clear at all. And that's kind of where those loopholes came in, where I like to view them as boundary violators, right?
Mhm.
That's where like our chronic boundary violators will swoop in and they will just disrespect your boundaries. They don't see your values as important to them, and it has nothing to do with you. It's completely on them. But when you're not clear with your boundaries, meaning what you need as well as the consequence, then it really opens that door for people to just kind of be like, "Oh, okay, whatever, I don't, they're not serious, or I don't need to take them serious." So the one thing that has helped me specifically is to really get clear on my boundary as well as the consequence. I'm trying to think like a specific instance. We have a family member who will usually, comment on whether it's like political debates or your weight or just anything that's kind of controversial that isn't a positive conversation to have at events. And so we really had to get clear on the boundary of like, hey, we love when you're here. We don't get to see you often. However, if these things keep popping up and they just really take a negative tone at the event, we're probably going to have to consider taking you off of the invite list.
Mhm.
And so after that, it was like a dramatic difference. There was no kickback. It was taken pretty well, and I'm assuming maybe they had their own feelings about it, but it never came out. And so I've just found that getting really clear has been really helpful. And if you're finding your boundaries are being pushed very often, I would encourage people to really look at like what does your boundaries look like and where can you get a little bit more clear with those consequences of what you are and aren't willing to tolerate.
Yeah, that's a great point because I think a lot of times we think we make them clear, like maybe by being a certain, like I'm speaking of myself, like I know like in the past, like, like I'll be a certain way, like if someone's kind of crossing a boundary that maybe I haven't even said, but I act more like annoyed. So I'm like, oh, it should be obvious to them.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
later you look inward and you're like, have I ever actually told them like, I don't like to be called at this time in the morning, or I don't, certain things like that. And it's like
Yeah.
just being clear with communication is going to go a long way.
100%. I mean, I use that even with my kids. Like that is a tactic when we're talking about certain things, whether that are safety or, you can use this toy when your brother's done, but you definitely cannot push him. Like your hands need to stay to yourself. So getting really clear is helpful in so many ways, even with our kids.